In this episode, I continued the conversation with David Howie on each of the specific MBTI dichotomies and their possible leadership implications. Now, of those 16 preferences, if we were to look on the chart that the MBTI folks provide us, I think they've got percentages in each of those preferences that show what percent of the population identifies or reports this certain preference, this certain personality type. And one of the things you'll realize is, I think the highest one is probably up close to 10%, approaching 10%, which would mean that if you identified with that particular preference, 90% of the population is different than you. And I think the important things when it comes to MBTI, at least in the context of the intermediate course, are the three premises. That first one is to realize that most people are going to be different than me. They're going to have operational preferences that are different than my own. Number two is there isn't any requirement for me to change. I don't have to change unless I want to. And the third is, how can I see value? Or how can I find value in other people's methods of operating? I ask that you kind of hold those three thoughts in mind as David and I kind of continue down and describe each of the dichotomies and what they might look like. And listening to this, you might have a better idea of what your reported preference might be in the instrument. So we'll start with the first dichotomy. David, do you want to take it from here?
Or you want to talk about
let's walk through
what they mean?
Let's walk through the four dichotomies. Let's start with the E and I dichotomy.
Okay. Well, the first dichotomy is extroversion, a preference for extroversion or introversion. Mm-hmm. And typically, people who have a preference for extroversion are very outwardly going. They're very engaging with other people. They're aware of other people around them. Mm-hmm. They might talk more than people who have a preference for introversion. And people who have extroversion preference are very comfortable with people that they don't know or with larger crowds. Mm-hmm. They like to engage with people, shake hands, meet people, talk to them, things like that.
Right.
And then if I have a preference for introversion, I'm more inwardly focused. I'm probably a little bit quieter, although that's not always the case. But these are folks who are more comfortable in not around a lot of people, and definitely not around people who they don't know. They're not real comfortable with that.
So at the end of a hard week, and it's now the weekend, how might a person with a preference for extroversion choose to recharge, choose to do with their weekend? What would be, generally speaking?
In my opinion, it's generally spending time with other people.
Okay.
In some kind of a venue.
Invite your friends over, watch the game, go to a party, go to a barbecue.
Right. And then the folks who have a preference for introversion, typically it will be some kind of an activity where it's either where they are alone, where they're doing something by themselves, or if it's with other people, it's a very it's something where there's not a lot of activity and
or with close people, spouse or children.
Right, or something very quiet where there's not a lot of stuff going on.
What might this look like at the workplace?
Well, it might look like a person with a preference for extroversion coming in, greeting everybody, kind of aggressively perhaps, walking around saying hello to everybody. And the person who has an introversion preference focused in on their work, not on the people around them, and kind of focusing inward on the stuff that they have to do that day. And so that you said that your first premise was that not everybody is going to be like me. And so if I have a preference for introversion, these people that are coming around saying hello to everybody, I might view that as an intrusion on my personal space. Mm-hmm. If I have a preference for extroversion, I might interpret the other folks as
cold and disconnected.
Yeah, they're not friendly at all.
Yeah.
Or they only care about themselves, and so that kind of is an automatic conflict that could be built into the workplace.
Right. You know, I mentioned in our earlier podcast that I'd just come back from a developmental assignment after having been gone for a year, and You all gave my desk away. So now I got the desk that's left in the quiet corner of the cube land. So after a few minutes when I get in the morning and I log in my computer, I kind of go make my rounds, and the introverts have settled in, and I'm going down each and every cubicle saying good morning, asking how their weekend was. That's just what I need to do to recharge as a self-reported E. And the I's, of course, we all teach this, so they're familiar with but that does describe the pattern of my behavior often seen at work environment.
And then E's people who have a preference for extroversion can have a conversation over the cubicle wall and just talk to each other, and then they're talking to everybody that's around them.
Right.
And the folks who have a preference for introversion, probably they may not appreciate that, because it's like I said, maybe they view that as an invasion of their personal space, or
they're having to expend energy to keep this person entertained or to engage them in conversation, whereas the person with the preference for E may feel like they're getting energy.
Right.
I think sometimes the I's refer to the E's as energy leeches.
Yeah.
Okay. The next dichotomy is the S and the N.
And that one is how we perceive the world. Mm-hmm. And so
a person with an S, that stands for sensing.
Okay.
And the N is for intuition. The reason why it starts with an N instead of an I is because we already use the I.
Right.
For the preference of introversion.
And so I'll just tell you about the sensing ones. I'll let you talk about the intuition preference.
Okay.
The sensing preference is nuts and bolts right now. What's practical? What makes sense? How's this going to work? How are we actually going to put this into use? What does the requirement actually say? Are we satisfying exactly what it's telling us to do? So that S and the sensing means it's a physical sensing of what I can touch, see with my own senses. Mm-hmm. If I can see it, if I can put my hands on it, then it's real to me. And if I can't, then I may not believe it. It's kind of like the motto of Missouri, which is the show me state. That's kind of the motto of the S preference is, okay, show me. Let's see. I want to see it in action, being used, being done practically. That's kind of the S preference.
Okay. Now, for my N preference, first of all, I need a context for things. What does it mean in the big picture? I need to see where it fits. Before I can start focusing on the details, I need to know why it's relevant. Instead of focusing on the trees, let me see the forest first before focusing on the specific species of tree. I'd say people with a preference for N are more likely to be able to appreciate fine art and understand the overall meaning. Okay, I can see why that was done. Or to come up with ideas on what if, or, this reminds me of the time that, this happened in history, or the time that I experienced this. Constantly linking things from the here and now into possibilities of what could be, or the overall big picture. That's how I see it. I see that happening as it plays out for me as a person with a strong preference for N. And throughout my Army career, oftentimes I was working with a lot of S's in the room, and I've been accused of being called the good idea fairy, or I do throw out an idea and I get, no, that's not found anywhere in doctrine. I'm like, I realize that, but it's an idea, and here's what it reminds me of, or here's how I can see it being applied in the overall big picture. Just think with me, think big for a minute, and so oftentimes people were frustrated, I think, working with me because they didn't feel that I was focused on the details enough. Usually panned out looking at the 10,000 foot view of things.
And so in the workplace, I think the conflict between the S preference and the N preference is, I think it's real simple, is that the N preference is people who have the preference for intuition, the N, are imaginative, are out-of-the-box thinkers, and they can frustrate the people with the S preference, because the S preference people are immediately thinking, that's not practical, that doesn't make any sense. Or like you said, that's never been done. How's that going to work? To me, there's that dichotomy. And then the S people, when they lay out a plan, it will be the N people will start to say, what about this? What about that? What about that? What about this? And the S people will be frustrated because, okay, I've already figured out exactly what we need to do. Here it is. And then the N people come in with all these great ideas. That's kind of how I see the conflict.
And I think it's apparent to see the value of both perspectives. So if you're trying to develop a strategy, you're trying to come up with some of that creative, innovative, out of the box thinking, somebody with that preference might be helpful in providing that perspective. There are absolutely times, though, where extreme attention to detail, checklists, SOPs are necessary, and there just isn't room for imaginative thinking at that time and moment, or things where the stakes are really high or risk tolerance is really low. There are certain people that would have a higher preference for honing in on those details. And
I think, I hate to box people in, but I've always had this feeling that people who have a preference for N, these out-of-the-box thinkers, are really good for long-range planning, for longer-term things, whereas the folks who have the S preferences are good for either shorter or medium-range planning, if that makes sense.
Yes, but again, that's generally speaking without assigning any labels.
Because I will tell you, even as I was saying that, I thought, but what if we're stuck and something's due in 2 days and I need a great idea? Who am I going to go to? And it may be that I go to, it may be that the person with the preference for intuition is the one who says, here's exactly how here's the idea that we could use to get us through the next 2 days. So
right. For me, I love generating ideas. I can come up with ideas all day. Here's how the future will be if we can leverage this idea. But for me, if somebody says, okay, fine, James, I agree, your idea is great, go ahead and start ironing out the details now. Start writing an SOP or a regulation now. And that's where I back off. I'm like, whoa, that's not my forte. I'm the big idea guy. I hate details.
Right. But this podcast thing you've been working on has probably pushed you out of that and caused you to grow a little bit with the kind of the planning that you've had to do and the figuring out exactly how to get this done. It would be my guess.
And my preferences, though, is to not have a script. I want it to be natural, flowing conversation where certain other people may say, no, there needs to be a script. Heaven forbid we sound like we don't know what we're talking about or we sound ill-prepared. There's that fear I see from the S side versus let it be what it is. That's what'll make it interesting.
All right. How about the thinking versus feeling?
Now, this is the one where I think recently there's some scrutiny from the scientific community that really those two aren't necessarily a true dichotomy, but that's for the listeners. You can go explore that. But we look at those and how we make decisions. Is it thinking and feeling? Let's discuss the two. So you said that your reported preference is F, feeling. Okay, tell us a little bit from the feeling perspective what that means.
Well, the feeling perspective is about being able to value. It's largely about empathy. It's being able to appreciate and value other people's reactions, other people's quote unquote feelings, to be able to realize how a certain situation might affect another person, and to be able to make decisions then that are in the personal best interest of other people.
Okay.
So there's a tendency to say things that make other people comfortable, to be able to make others comfortable around you. I heard that not too long ago as the definition of, I can't remember what it was, a gentleman or something like that, was the ability to make others around them comfortable.
Okay.
And so be able to compliment people. Let's see the good in people and people's intentions. That's how I see the feeling perspective.
But more mercy before justice.
Yes, that's a part of it also.
Or values-based decision-making. Okay, and I come out as a T, but I also value the feeling perspective. So there may be something to whether or not this is a true dichotomy or not, but I come out as a T, the problem first before people. And I think where it might manifest itself at work is how we perceive fairness. So let's say we worked for a corporation, it's the financial crisis, we have to downsize, and let's say I'm the CEO and I've got a T preference. I may say, you know what, we got to downsize. here's what I'm going to do so nobody has to get laid off. We're going to do a 10% cut across the board. I'm going to take a 10% cut as the CEO all the way down, and that's how we're going to keep everybody working, and that's fair. Everybody takes 10%. Now, from the feeler perspective, they may say that's not fair at all. I mean, the 10% cut for you, boss, means that your wife doesn't get a new Lexus for Christmas, but
right.
People on the factory floor now can't buy groceries.
Right, and you may, from a feeling perspective, would want to go around and really try to understand everybody's situation.
To step into the situation.
Right.
Versus the thinker side stepping outside the situation and trying to analyze it.
Because if you just say from kind of a management orientation, well, we're just going to do 10% right across the board. What you may have is unintended consequences that you didn't foresee about certain people that are going to be affected more so than others. And that's kind of where I think the people with a feeling preference would come in and say, time out. Before you do that, you need to look at how this is going to affect everybody in the entire organization.
Right.
And then take that into account before you just say it's just a flat 10%.
Right.
It's also, I've seen this happen in organizations where there's some edict that comes out that says, quote unquote, effective immediately, anyone who does this behavior or doesn't do this, get something turned in on time, is going to be reprimanded or something like that. And then you find out that 60% of the organization is doing that. So then you're going to reprimand 60%, a gigantic number of people. And the people with a feeling preference would say, okay, you can do that if that's your choice, but you got to take a look at how this is going to affect people, and not just how it's going to affect them, but what their attitude toward the organization is going to be.
Right.
If you're going to have this severe punishment down on people for whatever that infraction might have been.
The person with the thinking preference may say, look, this is the law. These are the rules. You guys were all aware, or should have been aware of the rules before said behavior had to be addressed. So it's really not my problem. You guys created the problem. You guys have created this for yourself. I'm just adhering to the rules.
And that's why this is actually one of my favorite of the dichotomies. This is my favorite one, because to me, this is the one where leaders get challenged the most. Because if I'm the thinking leader with a preference for thinking, I want to rely back on that, what you said. This is what the rules say. And sometimes leaders have to be that way. But then there's other times when a leader with a feeling preference says, all right, let's just have a timeout and let's look at the big picture. Let's consider the environment we're in, the situation, what this organization has been going through, on and on and on. And whoever it is that's making the decision has to be able to use the right preference for the situation. And that's what makes leadership so difficult, because there's a time for both. And what MBTI, I think what it does for the individual leader is, I have a preference that I'm either going to be thinking and say that's what the rules are, or I'm going to be feeling and say, well, let's look at how this affects everybody.
Right.
And I can't always do the one that I am most drawn to. I can't, if I'm thinking, I may not always be able to do that because I'm going to damage morale. But if I'm feeling, I may not be able to do that because you got to put your foot down. You got to apply the standards at some point. This is the one, I think, where leaders have to look at the situation and realize this is my preference, and sometimes that preference isn't right for the situation. And I have to do what they called it last week, in that a stretch goal. Basically, I've got to push myself to do something that I'm not comfortable with.
Right.
And that feeling, in the classroom, I used to say this, that's like when you're 5 years old getting ready to get on the roller coaster and you don't want to do it. I do not want to come down on people because I don't like doing that, or I don't want to have to listen to everybody's feelings about how this is affecting them.
Right.
And it's you look at that situation as a leader and you're like, I don't want to walk into that. I don't want to have to do that. But Effective leaders, this to me, this dichotomy of thinking versus feeling is the one that most stresses someone who is leading in an organization.
And I think as each and every one of us reflect back on our life and through our development, we can think, as we start to think about our ideal leaders from our past, I think each one of us can think of a time where we made a mistake, where somebody granted us some mercy, and we were better off for it. We knew they could have hammered me with the rules, and I'm actually better off for having been granted a little bit of mercy and correcting myself and chalking up to a learning experience. And the organization was better off for it as well.
And conversely, I'll also add this. There's sometimes in my past when somebody just put the hammer down on me, and that's what I needed. Mm-hmm. Even though I was hoping for mercy, I didn't get it, and that caused me to grow.
Right.
Because they held me to a hard standard and didn't back off. And I know times when that's happened to me, and the person that was doing it had I didn't have a positive feeling toward the person, but I know later, after the fact, I could see now how that made me a better leader.
Right. Well, going into the last dichotomy, the J and the P dichotomy, judging and perceiving, we are both self-reported Ps.
All right.
So we're going to have to talk third person about the people with the J preference.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about those two. Let's talk about this dichotomy.
Okay, this dichotomy is about, the theory says it's your orientation to the external world. And essentially, when I look at it, it's about whether you prefer to be in a structured or planned environment, or whether you are okay, or you prefer to be in unstructured or more of a flexible environment. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, the J's tend to see the world as a place that needs to be organized,
right,
and the P's tend to think of the world as a place to be experienced.
Right.
I want to keep my flexibility and my options open so I don't miss an experience, whereas those J's are like, nope, everything needs to be planned. I keep meticulous schedules and calendars. Back in the days, the day planners. People with a J who go on vacation tend to have long itineraries. They're going to be knowing what they're going to be doing in every hour during their vacation. Where the P's, just get me on a plane ticket. Oh, if I forgot to pack something, I'll buy it when I'm there. And that can make people with a J very uncomfortable with the J preference. And for the P's, when they're traveling with a J, it can make them feel like a killjoy.
And so the dichotomy in the conflict in the workplace to me is, the J's want to have a schedule, a sequence planned out,
right,
and they want the P's to commit to it, and the P's don't really want to commit to it. They want to keep it flexible. J preference boss might assign you a task and then ask you, like if it's due in a month, but then ask you every 3 or 4 days about it.
I need a progress report. Where are you?
Right, and the person with P preference is like, I got a whole month. How can I be worried about something that's due next month when I'm still finishing up all the stuff that's due tomorrow morning?
People with a P preference often have had the experience of getting superhuman strengths and abilities at the 11th hour against a deadline, and it's how people with P preference tend to operate against deadlines. But boy, can you make it all come together? But it's a little whimsical and a little this, little that. I still got time, and it can come across as procrastinating to some people. In the end, I'd say both dichotomies can get the work done. In fact, I find that leaving my options open when it comes to a task like that, because things are likely to change. So let's say the boss gives me a task and it's due in a month. If I have a preference for J, I'm likely to get on it right away, get it in my outbox, and wipe my hands and say done, and have that feeling of relief. But then what's likely to happen? You've finished it 3 weeks early, and a change comes, a Farrago comes, and now you got to redo it, or it's no longer relevant. Whereas I can sit back and start thinking about it, gathering bits and notes, and the boss hits me up with a change. I'm very resilient to change. Okay, great, because I haven't invested a whole lot in it yet anyway. I'll chalk it up. And so I tend to come across as more resilient and less stressed out with changes, but I also don't come across as being as organized, or with my time and calendar, I'm much more open to being flexible. And
it is that perceiving preference is, I view it as about being flexible, being able to be told at the very last minute, I need this or that tomorrow. And you're right. It's sometimes it's that the P preference doesn't get to it until then, or sometimes, like when you get it at that last minute, that rush of excitement is you get all this energy and you put out an awesome product in the time that it takes other people like a month or 2 months to do. I certainly find that.
Right.
So if it weren't for the last minute, a lot of things would never get done.
I agree. We don't have any J's in here to defend themselves.
Well, we need the J's because they can keep us organized.
I think J's tend to make great project managers to keep things on schedule, on track, especially when the stakes are high with money or with lives.
Right.
Where sometimes that type of structure is just needed. But I think sometimes you need the P's to be able to quickly respond to changes on the fly, or okay, here's how I see things now. I'm going to adapt, change, move out. And
I think for all 8 of these preferences, just as we've been talking, I've been thinking to myself, a healthy workplace, an effective team of people has all these things, and they're tools that are used at the right time, and people are comfortable being themselves, being the preference that they are. And so a good team has all of these characteristics, and the people who have the preferences feel safe and feel comfortable using their own preferences. There's not like some implication that you have to be like so-and-so, or you have to be like your boss.
Right.
Or
we only want people who think like us, or
right.
people who are diligent, working in quiet solitude in the basement.
Because all these people all need each other. I need for my preferences, I need people around me who have the opposite preference to pull me in different directions. And when you're a leader, if you're a supervisor and you're the head of an organization, you have to have people around you that provide balance to your preferences. And we have to respect each other and respect skills and abilities that other people bring. The other thing, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but nowhere in this theory does it say that you have to change, or that you should change, or that there's anything wrong with your preference.
Mm-hmm.
Each preference has the same value in an organization. It's just how the people in the organization, the degree to which they respect the differences in other people.
Right. Well, and I think that's one of the criticisms that sometimes comes from the scientific community on MBTI, is that it's all positive, or certainly not everything about all humans is positive. Some people may say, well, why don't you use the 5-factor theory, in your classrooms? That's what the scientific community uses. Well, then we'd have to describe or help people out with the good and the bad. And I don't think this is the type of environment where we want to focus on how neurotic we may be or personality disorders. It's let's look at the positives and work with those.
Well, and I can look at the descriptors of the behaviors for each dichotomy, and I don't have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to see how the terms that describe one of the dichotomies, you could see that there's a counter to that mm-hmm. we might view as negative. It is generally described in positive terms, but you can see how each one of the dichotomies to me has both strengths and liabilities.
Right. Well, David, I appreciate you joining me on this episode.
All right, and for the record, I forgot to ask you your preferences. I think they are ENTP. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. And so you and I share the E and the P.
Right.
And then the NT is where, or the S and the N and the T and the F is where we depart.
Well, yeah, and that S and that N, I think, is where we see it come up most often in the workplace. Or what about that time that we went camping? Remember that, David?
I do remember that.
Yes, and tell me what you see. It was in the middle of the night, and you leaned over and elbowed me.
Yeah, I put my elbow right into your ribs, and I said, "Hey, wake up! What do you see?"
And as I wiped the sleep from my eyes, as you can see, Orion's belt. In fact, I've just read an article from NASA that said that there's a new planet out there that could possibly be terrestrial-like and host alien life. And I can't help but wonder, as I look out there, could there be alien life looking back at me, wondering if I exist?
And as you're droning on and on about that, I said to you, no, somebody has stolen our tent.
And therein lies the difference in the preference between S and N. And with that, thank you, David. And
All right. Thank you.
In the next episode of the AMSC podcast, I sit down with John Kotzman, another instructor from the intermediate course, and discuss the topic of critical thinking.
22 in Chapter 5 tells us critical thinking is a thought process that aims to find facts, to think through issues, and solve problems. Critical thinking examines a problem in depth with multiple points of view.
That's next time on the AMSC podcast. And we welcome your feedback. Please write us at usarmy.leavenworth.tradoc.mbx.amsc-podcast@mail.mil, or you can just write us at amscpodcast@gmail.com.